There are moments in medicine when everything you've learned, every protocol you've memorized, every piece of advanced technology at your fingertips becomes completely useless. I'm about to tell you about the day I watched a young man dying on my table, bleeding out faster than we could replace his blood, while a senior doctor screamed that nothing was working. In that moment of absolute chaos, I closed my eyes and heard my grandfather's voice from 30 years ago, teaching me something the modern medical world had completely forgotten. What I did next could have ended my career, gotten me sued, maybe even sent me to prison. But I had to make a choice, and I had less than 3 minutes to make it. This is my story, and I'm telling it exactly as it happened, because what took place in that trauma room challenged everything I thought I knew about medicine. My name is Linda Hartwell, and I've been a trauma nurse for 23 years. I work at Detroit Metropolitan Hospital in Michigan, one of the busiest trauma centers in the Midwest. When people ask me why I chose this career, why I deliberately walked into a job where death shows up for work every single day, I tell them about my grandfather. Harold Hartwell was a field medic in World War II, stationed in France during some of the bloodiest battles of 1944. I grew up in Ann Arbor, a quiet college town about 40 miles from Detroit, but my childhood was filled with his stories. Not the glory stories, not the hero tales, but the real ones. The ones about holding a 19-year-old soldier's hand while he bled out in a muddy trench. The ones about making impossible decisions with no equipment, no backup, and no time. My grandfather taught me that medicine isn't about having the best technology or the fanciest degree. It's about keeping your head clear when everyone else is panicking, and remembering that behind every emergency, there's a human being who wants to go home. He died when I was 17, but his voice never left me, especially on the worst days, especially on the day I'm about to describe. If this story has already grabbed you, go ahead and subscribe to the channel now, because what comes next is going to surprise you even more. It was a Tuesday in February, and Detroit was buried under the kind of winter that makes you question why anyone lives this far north. Temperatures were hovering around 8 degrees Fahrenheit. The roads were sheets of black ice, and the emergency radio had been crackling non-stop since 6 in the morning. We'd already handled 2 car accidents when the call came in at 2:15 in the afternoon. 7 vehicle pileup on Interstate 75, multiple critical injuries inbound. I remember looking at my colleague Jennifer and seeing the same thought in her eyes. This was going to be bad. When the ambulances started arriving, it was controlled chaos. We had protocols for mass casualties. Everyone knew their role. But there's always that moment when reality hits, and you realize the textbook didn't prepare you for this. The first 4 patients were manageable. Broken bones, lacerations, 1 concussion. Then Marcus Williams came through the doors, 28 years old, construction worker, father of a 6-month-old daughter. His vehicle had been crushed between 2 semi-trucks. The paramedics had him on a backboard, pressure bandages soaked through with blood, and his face was the color of old newspaper. Thank you for staying with me this far. It shows that you're feeling what I felt when I lived through all of this. So go ahead and subscribe and hit that bell, because what comes next changes everything. The trauma bay smelled like it always does during the worst cases. Blood, antiseptic, fear. The overhead lights were brutally bright, fluorescent tubes that turned everything into sharp contrasts and deep shadows. Marcus was on the table, and I could hear the monitors before I could see them. His heart rate was 140 beats per minute and climbing. Blood pressure was 70/40 and dropping fast. We cut away his clothes and found the source immediately. His left femoral artery had been torn open, probably from a piece of twisted metal that had penetrated the vehicle door. The wound was catastrophic. Dr. Morrison, our senior attending, took one look and started barking orders. Pressure, more pressure, get me clamps. Where's the vascular surgeon? Call the OR, type and cross for 8 units. I pressed down on the femoral artery with both hands, feeling the hot blood pulsing between my fingers despite the pressure. It wasn't working. We tried the standard protocols, direct pressure at multiple points, elevation, hemostatic agents. The bleeding slowed for maybe 10 seconds, then came back stronger. Marcus's eyes were open, confused, terrified. He kept trying to speak but couldn't form words. His lips were turning blue. Now I want to hear from you. Where are you watching this story from? Write it in the comments. It's incredible to see people from so many places following stories like this. Dr. Morrison was a good doctor, maybe even a great one, but I could see the panic starting to creep into his movements. His hands were shaking slightly as he tried different approaches. Nothing was working. We had a second-year resident, Dr. Paula Chen, assisting, and she had frozen completely, just staring at the arterial spurts with wide eyes. The vascular surgeon was 15 minutes out, stuck in the same traffic that had caused the pileup in the first place. Marcus had maybe 5 minutes left, probably less. His pressure was now 60/30. The monitor was screaming. Dr. Morrison looked at me and said something I'll never forget. He said, "You can't stop this bleeding. Nobody can. We're losing him." And in that moment, with my hands covered in this young man's blood, I heard my grandfather's voice, clear as day, like he was standing right next to me. It was a memory from my 12th birthday. We were in his kitchen in Ann Arbor, and he was showing me his old medical kit from the war. He pulled out a faded photograph of soldiers in a field hospital and said, "Linda, the fancy equipment is nice, but when you have nothing, when everything fails, there's an old technique we used in the trenches. The doctors here don't teach it anymore because they think it's primitive, but I saw it save 47 men in the summer of 1944. I was 12 years old, sitting at my grandfather's kitchen table on a Saturday afternoon. The kitchen smelled like coffee and old wood. He had spread out his war memorabilia, something he rarely did, photographs in cracked frames, letters written on paper so thin you could see through it, and his medical kit, olive green canvas worn smooth from decades of handling. He opened it carefully and showed me instruments I'd never seen before. Then he pulled out a photograph, and I remember it so clearly. It showed a field hospital, just tents really, with wounded soldiers lying on cots. My grandfather pointed to one of the medics in the photo and said, "That's me, 22 years old and responsible for keeping boys alive long enough to get them to a real hospital." He told me about a technique he learned from a French doctor, a man named Dr. Laurent Beaumont who had served in World War I. "When you have a major arterial bleed and nothing is working," Dr. Beaumont said, "you use the body's own pressure systems against the bleed. It's about angles, about creating a pressure differential, about understanding physics as much as anatomy." My grandfather showed me the hand positions, the way you elevate at a specific angle, the multi-point compression that creates a cascade effect. He made me practice on a diagram. I thought it was just an old man's nostalgia, teaching a kid something that would never matter. Back in the trauma bay, Marcus was dying. Dr. Morrison was preparing to call it. I could see his shoulders slumping, that terrible moment when a doctor starts to accept defeat. That's when I spoke up. I said, "I have an idea." Dr. Morrison looked at me like I'd lost my mind. "Hartwell," he said, "unless you've got a miracle in your pocket, this kid is gone." His voice was sharp, frustrated, grieving already. I took a deep breath and said, "There's a technique from World War II, cascade pressure application with angular elevation. It was used for arterial bleeds when modern clamps weren't available." Dr. Morrison's face went red. He actually yelled at me. He said, "Are you serious right now? You want me to use something from 100 years ago? That's not even in the protocol. I could lose my license. We both could." I looked at Marcus. His eyes were starting to glaze. The monitor showed his pressure at 55/20. I looked back at Dr. Morrison and said something that surprised even me. I said, "He's already dying. We've tried everything modern medicine has to offer, and it hasn't worked. What do we have to lose? Give me 2 minutes. If it doesn't work, you can document that I went rogue and you tried to stop me. But if it works, this man goes home to his baby daughter." Dr. Morrison stared at me for what felt like an hour, but was probably 3 seconds. Then he stepped back and said, "2 minutes. Show me." I moved into position, my hands already knowing what to do from that afternoon 30 years ago in my grandfather's kitchen. I instructed Dr. Chen to apply pressure at 2 specific points on Marcus's lower abdomen, creating a pressure dam that would redirect blood flow. I had Jennifer elevate his leg at exactly 45 degrees, while maintaining external rotation at the hip. This was critical. The angle changed the pressure gradient in the femoral system. Then I applied what my grandfather called the cascade grip. It's not just pressure on the artery, it's rhythmic compression at 3 points simultaneously, the proximal femoral, the mid-femoral, and just above the inguinal ligament, in a specific sequence. Press, hold for 2 seconds, release for half a second, press the next point. It creates a wave effect that essentially tricks the vascular system into clotting more efficiently. The whole time, I was talking Marcus through it. "Stay with me, Marcus. You're going home today. Your daughter needs you. I need you to fight." Dr. Morrison was watching with his arms crossed, skeptical but desperate enough to let me try. The first 30 seconds were terrifying. Nothing changed. Blood was still pulsing out between my fingers. I could feel Dr. Morrison getting ready to push me aside. My arms were burning from the pressure I was applying. Dr. Chen looked like she might pass out. Then, at about 45 seconds, I felt something shift. The blood flow pulsed once, twice, then seemed to hesitate. 60 seconds in, and the arterial spurts were noticeably weaker. The monitor chirped. Pressure reading, 58/25. Still critical, but moving in the right direction. Dr. Morrison leaned in, watching closely now. 90 seconds. The bleeding had reduced by about 70%. I could see the torn edges of the artery starting to retract slightly. The body's natural response finally kicking in, now that it had help. At 2 minutes, Marcus's pressure read 65/30. His heart rate was still elevated, but no longer climbing. The bleeding hadn't stopped completely, but it had slowed enough that the body could start compensating. Dr. Morrison's entire demeanor changed. He jumped back in, his hands steady again, and started working on temporary repairs that would hold until the vascular surgeon arrived. When Dr. Patricia Walsh, the vascular surgeon, finally burst through the doors 12 minutes later, Marcus was stable enough for transport to the OR. Marcus survived the surgery. Dr. Walsh repaired his femoral artery, and he was extubated 36 hours later, but my ordeal was just beginning. 3 days after the incident, I was called before the hospital's medical review board. Someone had filed a complaint that I used an unauthorized procedure, deviated from established protocols, and potentially endangered a patient's life. I sat in a conference room with 5 administrators and 4 senior physicians, including Dr. Morrison, who had to testify about what happened. I brought everything I could find. My grandfather's journal from the war, with detailed descriptions and diagrams of the technique, historical medical papers from 1915 through 1950, documenting the cascade pressure method, research articles about field medicine in combat situations. I even found Dr. Laurent Beaumont's original published paper from 1922 in a French medical journal. The board listened, but I could tell they were skeptical. The hospital's legal counsel was particularly hostile, concerned about liability. They asked me why, if this technique was so effective, it wasn't part of modern trauma protocols. I didn't have a good answer except to say that sometimes progress means forgetting things that actually worked. The hearing was going badly until Dr. Yoshi Takahashi spoke up. He was the oldest member of the board, maybe 75 years old, semi-retired but still consulting on complex cases. He'd been quiet the whole time, just listening. Then he cleared his throat and said, "I know this technique. I used it in Vietnam in 1968 and 69. I was a surgical resident attached to a field hospital near Da Nang. We had limited supplies, overwhelmed facilities, and injuries that would make your trauma bay look like a quiet Tuesday. I personally witnessed this method save 14 soldiers when we had nothing else." He looked directly at me and said, "The reason it's not in modern protocols isn't because it doesn't work. It's because it requires skill, presence of mind, and it can't be easily standardized or taught in a weekend course. Modern medicine prefers protocols that anyone can follow mechanically. This requires a nurse or doctor to actually understand anatomy, physics, and to make real-time adjustments. It was deemed too complicated for the era of algorithms and checklists." The room went silent. Dr. Takahashi pulled out his phone and started making calls right there. Within a week, a formal study was initiated to re-examine historical trauma techniques that had been abandoned. Marcus Williams was discharged 3 weeks after the accident. He came to visit me in the trauma bay, walking on his own, healthy and whole. He brought his wife and his baby daughter, Emily. He hugged me and cried, and he had no idea that his life had been saved by knowledge from a war that ended decades before he was born. Sometimes the old ways aren't outdated. Sometimes they're just waiting for someone to remember. I think about that day often, about how close we came to losing Marcus, because modern medicine had decided something was too old-fashioned to be valuable. We have incredible technology now, and I'm grateful for it, but I learned something important. Progress isn't just about moving forward. Sometimes it's about remembering what worked before, and asking ourselves why we stopped doing it. My grandfather saved 47 soldiers with his hands, his knowledge, and his courage. I saved one man the same way. That's enough for me. So here's what I want to ask you. Do you believe that sometimes old knowledge can be more valuable than all of modern technology? Have you ever been in a situation where intuition beat protocol? I'd love to hear your experiences in the comments. If this story moved you, please subscribe to the channel for more real stories from healthcare professionals who face impossible decisions every day. And don't forget to watch the next recommended video about another extraordinary medical case that'll leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about medicine. Thank you for listening to my story.